A policewoman stands in the living room of a small house in Enfield just after 1 in the morning. The children are close together. The adults are trying not to move. Then the boy points toward a chair beside the sofa, and then the chair starts to wobble. A moment later, according to the officer's signed statement, it slides across the floor on its own. The Enfield Poltergeist is one of the most famous and well-documented cases from the UK. It has had multiple documentaries made about it, inspired movies and TV shows, and hooked my interest and fascination from the moment I heard about it. So, it would be amiss for me not to cover it on this channel. I'm James Deverell. Welcome to THS Case Files. That chair moving by itself was just the beginning. Over the next year, a council house in North London would become the centre of one of the most disputed haunting cases in modern history. A case involving police witnesses, flying objects, tape recordings, child voices that didn't sound like children, and just enough deception to make the whole thing even harder to understand.
No.
Who's there?
Doctor.
In 1977, the Hodgson family lived at 284 Green Street in Brimstown, Enfield, in a 3-bedroom semi-detached council house built in the 1920s. Peggy Hodgson was a 47-year-old divorced mother raising 4 children there: Margaret, Janet, Johnny, and Billy. The house was modest. The street was ordinary. Nothing about it matched the grand old house mythology people usually attach to a haunting. Enfield did not begin as a legend. It began as a family emergency. Neighbours were called first, then the police, then the newspapers, then the Society for Psychical Research. Within days, a local disturbance turned into national news. Within months, it became one of the most documented poltergeist cases on record. Not because the evidence was so clear, but because it left behind statements, recordings, photographs, broadcasts, and named witnesses whose accounts can still be considered today. From the start, this was a household under a lot of pressure. A large fatherless family struggling financially, curious yet supportive neighbours, journalists smoking in the sitting room. It was the 70s after all. Investigators setting up tape machines and waiting through the night for another sound to confirm the presence of something supernatural. In a setting like that, every knock has an impact. Every silence does too.
How many voices are there?
600.
It began on a Wednesday night. At around 9:30 p.m. on August 31st, Janet and Johnny Hodgson heard shuffling in their bedroom. Peggy Hodgson came in to check on them. Then they all heard a knocking sound. Soon after that, according to the earliest accounts, a chest of drawers moved about 18 inches across the room without anyone touching it. This activity was enough to send the family next door for help. Their neighbours, Vic and Penny Nottingham, came over with their son, Gary. Vic later said the knock seemed to follow him around the house, a detail that has stayed with people for decades. This was not just a sound in one wall. Witnesses felt that the noise was responding to them. If someone investigating stepped into another room, it seemed to shift, go quiet, and it too went quiet. Imagine for a second, a tight living room, thin interior walls, lamps throwing a dull yellow light over carpet and nicotine-stained wallpaper. Children crowding close to adults. Someone presses a hand against the wall. Someone else holds their breath after each knock is heard. No one wanting to be the first person to say what they were all thinking. Peggy Nottingham then called the police. At about 1 in the morning, WPC Caroline Heaps and PC Hymes arrived at the house. Heaps later gave one of the most important statements in the entire case. She described the family telling police that strange things had been happening during the last few nights and that they believed the house was haunted. The officers went into the living room. The lights were switched off. Then came the knocking. Heaps recounted, almost immediately I heard the sound of knocking on the wall. There were 4 distinct taps on the wall, and then silence. She added later that the taps came from another wall, and when they checked the attic, pipes and walls, they found nothing that explained these noises. Then came the chair. In her statement, Heaps wrote, "I looked at the chair and noticed it was wobbling slightly from side to side. I then saw the chair slide across the floor towards the kitchen wall. It moved approximately 3 to 4 feet and then came to rest." She added, "At no time did it appear to leave the floor. I checked the chair but could find nothing to explain how it had moved." Although this does not necessarily prove the house was haunted, it does make the first night of reported events harder to dismiss. Most rational people experiencing paranormal activity would most likely try to find a conclusion themselves before involving the police for fear of being considered irrational or just plain crazy. Although, in addition to that, police officers can misread a situation. Anyone can. Still, a named officer on duty giving a signed statement after attending a scene is not nothing. It means the case entered the public record immediately, and it entered with a witness whose account still shapes every serious discussion of Enfield now. Over the next few days, the disturbances continued. Marbles and Lego bricks were reported flying through rooms. Small objects struck walls and floors. On September 4th, the Hodgson's neighbour, Peggy Nottingham, phoned British newspaper The Daily Mirror. She was looking for help. Instead, she opened the case to the national press. Reporter Douglas Bench and photographer Graham Morris came to the house. Both said they saw objects moving by themselves. Morris later said he was struck in the head by a flying Lego brick. Years later, Morris still described that moment in very plain terms. "I got struck on the head with a Lego brick that was flying through the air, and I knew that no one was throwing anything because I could see everybody in the room," he said. And then he added, "I could see everyone in front of me, and no one was throwing anything. So I was convinced that something was happening." Morris did not walk into the house as a believer, but these statements indicate that that changed once he had had his first-hand experience. He walked in as a newspaper photographer expecting a strange but unbelievable story. But then he kept coming back. "We were there just about every night. It was too fascinating not to," Morris later recalled. Then he described the rhythm of these visits. "We'd be sitting in the sitting room for hours and hours just waiting for something to happen. And then, bang. Got upstairs to find this bed had turned itself sideways and was stood up against the wall. And we couldn't have done that between us, let alone the children. Whether you accept that as evidence or not, it captures the feel of Enfield better than almost anything else. The waiting, the fatigue, the sudden noises people would rush to explore. This is where the case starts to split in two. One version is domestic and immediate, a frightened family in a cramped house dealing with loud knocks and objects moving when they shouldn't. The other is public and theatrical, reporters making notes, cameras waiting, investigators arriving, and the house becoming a place people visit in hopes of seeing something with their own eyes. Maurice Gross visited Enfield on September 5th after being contacted through the Society for Psychical Research. Guy Lyon Playfair joined him on September 12th. Over the next year, the two men would make around 180 visits and spend 25 all-night vigils at the house. They recorded extensively, they kept notes, they tried to separate the events from exaggeration. According to later summaries, Gross and others reported marbles flying through the air and landing without rolling, doors and drawers opening on their own, a fish tank lid lifting, chimes swinging, cushions being thrown, furniture overturning, and Janet Hodgson apparently being lifted and deposited in different places. Some of these incidences had multiple witnesses, some did not. Some were vivid, some lasted only a second and vanished before anyone could get a proper look. There is also a witness who gets mentioned far less often than she should. Hazel Short, a local crossing guard, or lollipop lady as they say in England. She told Playfair that she was approaching the house to collect the lollipop sign she usually hid under the hedge when she saw books strike the window. Her account is vivid. "I was standing there looking at the house, when all of a sudden a couple of books came flying across and hit the window. It was so sudden. I heard the noise because it was so quiet. There was no traffic, and it made me jump." Then she said she saw Janet rising and falling behind the window, as though someone were just tossing her up and down bodily. That account was interesting because it came from outside the family and places the action at the window, visible from the street. Another important account came from Daily Mirror reporter George Fallows, who was frank about how difficult the setting was. Because of the emotional atmosphere at the house and in the neighbourhood, ranging from hysteria through terror to excitement and tension, it has been difficult to record satisfactory data. But then he added something just as important. To the best of our ability, we have eliminated the possibility of total trickery, although we have been able to simulate most of the phenomena. It is one of the most honest lines ever attached to the case. It supports the story and undercuts it at the same time. And that is kind of representative of the Enfield case as a whole. By November, the case had reached television. The BBC's Nationwide aired a segment on November 23rd, 1977. Once that happened, the haunting no longer belonged only to Green Street, it belonged to the whole country.
I'm invisible.
You're invisible? Why are you invisible?
So my G hangs out as T.
At this point, this case stopped being mainly about knocks and moving furniture. It became about a voice. According to witnesses and recordings, Janet Hodgson began speaking in a deep, rough, abrasive voice that many listeners said sounded like an old man. It was not a brief outburst. It carried on. It answered questions. It taunted people in the room. At times, it claimed to be the spirit of a former resident named Bill Wilkins. The line most often repeated was this: "Just before I died, I went blind, and then I had a hemorrhage, and I fell asleep and I died in the chair in the corner downstairs." Believers pointed to that statement as possible identification. Critics argued the information was never secure enough to rule out performance or leakage. What gives the voice its staying power, however, is not just the things it said, it was how it sounded.
Then I had an hemorrhage, and I fell asleep, and I died in a chair in the corner downstairs.
It has a damaged, scraped quality, the kind of throat sound that makes your own throat feel sore when you hear it on tape. Even people who reject the paranormal often admit that the recordings are deeply unpleasant. This is not a knock from another room. This is something speaking from a bed through a child, while adults around her keep asking questions because they can't decide whether they're hearing fraud, stress, or something far stranger. Skeptics had an answer. Some pointed to ventriloquism and unusual voice production. Professional ventriloquist Ray Allen reportedly visited and believed the girls were making the voice themselves. The fact that not all investigators treated the voice as equally strong evidence was significant. Even people sympathetic to the case recognized that this was one of its weakest pressure points. But standing in one of those rooms, late at night, that distinction might not have helped very much. There are a lot of haunting stories that are built on shadows and suggestion. Enfield had those too, but Enfield also had this thing talking back. By 1978, the case had become a long occupation on the family's life. Strange incidents were still reported, but now they existed alongside scrutiny, fatigue, and open disagreement over what counted as evidence. In May 1978, an SPR committee reviewed the case and, in later summaries, took a cautious position. Some testimony from credible witnesses supported a paranormal interpretation, while other incidents remained weak, doubtful, or too muddy to judge cleanly. That balance is easy to miss. It is also one of the most revealing parts of the record. This case did not end with one final dramatic event. It simply wore down. Now, that is often how stories like this close, not with certainty, but with less. Fewer major incidents, fewer visitors, less noise, less confidence. People go back to work, investigators trying to turn stacks of notes into something coherent. Broadcasters shape recordings into documentaries. The family goes on living in the same rooms where strangers once sat for hours waiting for the next noise. By late 1978 and into 1979, the haunting had entered its afterlife. BBC Radio 4 aired the Enfield Poltergeist documentary. Guy Lyon Playfair later built his 1980 book This House is Haunted around the case. The activity faded, the debate did not. Now let's dive into the skeptic theories. Deliberate hoaxes and opportunistic prankery. This remains the strongest skeptical model. It accounts for known staged incidents, the weakness of many crowded room observations, the disputed voice, and the photographs that can be read as children jumping or merely performing. Janet later admitted at least a small part of the case had been faked. Even if that part was small, the admission changes everything. Stress, suggestion, and amplified perception. A crowded family under strain, broken sleep, constant attention, and a house full of anxious adults can distort how events are perceived and remembered. In that kind of setting, ordinary knots become loaded. Half-seen movements harden into certainty. Emotional tone can spread through a room faster than facts can. Co-witness memory conformity. This explanation deserves more attention than it usually gets. Research on memory conformity shows that when people witness an event and then discuss it with other witnesses, their memories can shift and merge. One person's detail becomes another person's recollection. At Enfield, witnesses were constantly talking. Family members, neighbours, reporters, investigators, broadcasters. In a case like that, the record may contain not just raw perception, but socially edited memory. That doesn't mean everyone lied. It means the story could become more coherent and more dramatic each time it was retold. The early mundane trigger and then later narrative escalation. The first noises may have had ordinary causes, plumbing, house acoustics, settling, or small-scale mischief. Once fear took hold and outsiders arrived, the story may have escalated through expectation, imitation, and reward. In that reading, the case became bigger than whatever launched it. That would fit the early uncertainty, the later theatrics, and the way publicity transformed the house into a stage. Now let's look at this through the lens of believers. This was a genuine spirit-focused poltergeist. There is the classic interpretation. Something external was active in the house. It produced knocks, moved objects, and at times used Janet as a vehicle for speech. Supporters point to the police statement, the outside witnesses, and the range of reported disturbances as reasons the whole case cannot be reduced to just mere prankery. The Enfield Poltergeist could have been a mixed case, real activity contaminated by fraud. This is probably the most durable pro-Enfield position because it explains why the case looks so compromised. Some incidents may have been staged, others may have been genuine. Children might imitate what they do not understand. Adults might exaggerate what they are desperate to make sense of. If there was a real core event, the hoax elements would not erase it, they would bury it. That model fits the contradictory texture of Enfield better than an all-or-nothing answer. This brings us to recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, the living agent theory. This one comes up less often in mainstream coverage, but it has a long history in parapsychology. Instead of a ghost, the focus is a person, usually a stressed child or adolescent, unconsciously producing physical effects through psychokinesis. In this view, Janet would not be channeling a dead man, she would be the center of a force she could not control. The theory, often called RSPK, has appealed to many parapsychologists because it helps explain why activity often clusters around specific people and emotionally volatile environments. Then, of course, there could have been an attention-fed PSI loop. This is the strangest theory here, and one I almost never hear explored properly. If you combine the living agent model with the extraordinary level of observation at Enfield, you get another possibility, that the attention itself may have amplified the effects. More witnesses, more tension, more anticipation, more recording, more pressure on the focal person. In that framework, the phenomenon is not just attached to the house or the child, it is fed by the emotional field around them, almost like a feedback loop between expectation, stress, and physical disturbance. This is speculative, but it does fit one odd feature of Enfield. The more people gathered to watch, the more unstable the atmosphere often seemed to become. That is an inference from the RSPK model, not a proven conclusion. When I strip away the movie mythology, the later embellishments, and the tidy internet summaries, I don't think Enfield lands cleanly on either side. I think the family was genuinely frightened. I think some early witnesses saw events that felt real in the moment, including one police officer whose statement still carries weight. The reports from Graham Morris and Hazel Short are worth paying attention to as well. These are not anonymous campfire voices. They are named people tied to a case that left documents behind. I also think the record is compromised beyond repair. There was performance in that house. There was pressure. There were children who understood that adults were watching them. There were reporters looking for the next image. There were investigators who believed enough to keep returning, and skeptics who believed enough in error to keep looking for cracks. All of that is inside the evidence now. None of it can be cleanly peeled away. So, where does that leave you? Thanks for watching. I'm James Deverell. This has been Tales of High Strangeness.